welcome to Historia Canadiana. This is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literary based, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. My name is Patrick, and today we're going to continue our coverage, our very broad coverage, on a genre of literature that is central to understanding Canada, that is, exploration writings. If you haven't listened to my previous episode, I recommend that you do, simply because we establish a few key components in it that are important even if today's topic is set in a time a little over a century and a half later. So today we're going to be talking about a Scottish explorer who predates the famous duo of Lewis and Clark in being the first European to travel the breadth of the North American continent. And he did it from Canada, which is even wider than the US. That means that in my book, it makes it all the more impressive. Just so we're clear here, you'll see often in the literature about our subject today that he crossed North America north of Mexico, because Mexico is officially part of North America. So we need to specify north of Mexico, since people had crossed Mexico before. It's a little bit less wide than Canada or the United States, right? Anyway, digression aside, the longest river in our country, which extends from the Northwest Territories to the Beaufort Sea, is actually named after him in honor of his accomplishment, because receiving a knighthood, as we'll see later, is apparently not enough. As if you already didn't know from the title of this episode, today, as a way of completing our episodes on exploration literature, we are talking about Sir Alexander Mackenzie and his writings that tell the tale of his voyages from Montreal to the Arctic Ocean and later to the Pacific Ocean, going from sea to sea to sea. Now, modern editions of the journals of Alexander Mackenzie cover both major travels in a single volume, so they're quite easy to find if ever you're so inclined, both online or in paper form. Through the expeditions that took place in 1789 and 1793 respectively, we are going to examine how the fur trade in Canada evolved since the era of New France that we covered last time, and learn about how the territory that would become Canada, as we know it today, was not as well defined and clear-cut as it is now, with multiple companies, natives, and Europeans all scrambling along the territory as trade, survival, war, and society building take place in new shapes under the British rule that was being established after the French Empire dissipated on the continent after 1763. So by that long sentence, you probably know that we have a lot to cover. So let's get cracking. At least we can take comfort in the fact that we're basing ourselves off of one man's perspective, making our task a bit easier and condensable. Anyway, on with the show. The last episode, we left off at the start of the French colony in Canada, called New France. We will be returning to it in order to develop just what life was like during the French regime, but the main goal here is to compare how the French and English approached exploration, society building, and how they start to establish just where this colony is going to be headed. What exactly sticks in the transition from one empire to the next, and what is deemed as important by Alexander Mackenzie when compared to someone like Samuel de Champlain. Sometimes I'll let you dictate what the similarities are based off of what you heard last episode, but I'll try to make a few connections. At least, in as much as we can reasonably compare the two. We're going to accomplish this in much the same way as we did last time with Champlain, by establishing the Canadian context at the time, before explaining who Mackenzie was and what his missions entailed, before diving into what his travel journals can tell us. So, what, broadly speaking, is Canada at the time we are referring to, in the 1780s and 90s? By now, as you've certainly gathered by my multiple mentions of it, Canada is controlled by the British. Furthermore, and this is not related to Canada per se, although it will have an impact, America's independence from Great Britain has recently been secured after the War of Independence that began in 1775. So the continent, after having seen 2 decades of being fully British, from 1763 to 1783, or mostly British, the Spanish are on the west coast, was clearly divided into something akin to what we see today. Neither of the countries were as big as today, with westward expansion being a rather progressive thing, but the north-south division we know is securing itself into a relatively stable border. While it is not the focus of today's episode, there are a few things to note about the impact of American independence on Canada. For one, the territory, which was called the Province of Quebec at the time, was significantly diminished, where in 1763, the territory of the Province of Quebec extended from modern-day Newfoundland to below the Great Lakes into what is approximately modern-day Illinois. Contrast that to 1783, after the American Revolution. Access to anything south of the Great Lakes became increasingly difficult for the British in light of American control of what used to be the 13 colonies on the east coast below Quebec. It was a bit harder to justify going in and out and below that parallel. By the time we reached 1791, the province of Quebec, which was pretty much covering the space from southern Quebec to southern Ontario today, was divided into 2 provinces, Upper and Lower Canada, Ontario and Quebec, respectively. The maritime provinces were also British colonies, but were separate from Upper and Lower Canada. They were their own thing. They were Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, so on and so forth. One of the major differences between our current period and the early 17th century in which Champlain was living in is what the rest of the territory of Canada looked like. Essentially, it was a large, monopolized trading space. West of Upper Canada, all the way to southern Alberta, including parts of the territory now known as Nunavut, there was what was known as Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was owned by the now famous Hudson's Bay Company, which was specialized in fur trading at the time. If you're wondering, yes, the department store can trace its origins back to this point in time. In 1670, the British Crown would grant a charter to the company to give it the right to exploit the aforementioned territory. Rupert's Land would remain privately owned territory until 1870, when the recently formed Canadian government would outright buy it in order to bridge the gap between Ontario and British Columbia. That's neither here nor there, though, as British Columbia was not a thing yet in the 1780s and 90s. What we do need to know is that beyond Rupert's Land was territory still occupied by native populations, and if you go further north towards Alaska, the Russians. So to quickly recap what the 1780s looked like for North American geography, north of the modern Canada-US border from east to west, you find the Maritime Provinces, Lower Canada, Upper Canada, Rupert's Land, and then Native American living and hunting grounds. They had those already interspersed throughout the rest of Canada, but what I mean by Native American living and hunting grounds was a place where it was completely untouched by Europeans. South of the border is the United States of America, which at the time covers about the East Coast to just below the Great Lakes, roughly where Iowa and Missouri begin. The rest of the territory still belongs to the Spanish Empire at this point, including Florida, Mexico, which was much larger at the time, and the western half of the American continent. The French would only buy Louisiana, which was much bigger at the time, in 1800 and only sell it to the Americans in 1803. That should give you an idea of the space that we're dealing with here. Before we get into Mackenzie and his exploits, I do want to mention the other major fur trading company operating on the Canadian territory at this time, which is called the Northwest Company. While it is significantly smaller in size than the Hudson's Bay Company, It is a very important player in the trade because it operates around the St. Lawrence Valley, which, as we covered in the last episode, is the best and easiest way to enter into the continent at this time. Unlike the Hudson's Bay ships, who must go around Newfoundland and Quebec to get to their ports, those of the Northwest Company can access their own very directly by just entering into the St. Lawrence. I mention this company despite its lesser legacy when compared to the Hudson's Bay because this is the company that Alexander Mackenzie will later be a part of. More on that later. Let's first get into the man himself and what led him to this point of fame as the first European cross North America. In talking about Alexander's early life, Mackenzie was born near Stornoway in the northwest of Scotland in 1762. The Mackenzie family were a prominent mercantile one in that region, and young Alexander would have been relatively well-to-do in that part of Scotland that they were in. In 1774, when he was only 12 years old, Alexander would actually cross the Atlantic Ocean with his father, Kenneth, who was a low-ranking officer in the British Army, in order to reach New York, where his uncle lived. This would have been after his mother died. The New World, despite having seen some serious development from a European standpoint for nearly 2 centuries at this point, was still seen as a land of new opportunities and discoveries, which it very much was for a young and well-to-do British family like the Mackenzies. It was a fresh start after the death of a loved one. Now, some of you might have noticed the date of arrival of Alexander as very close to a major event in American history. Less than a year after their arrival in 1775, the American War of Independence begins. Where the war began as little more than skirmishes here and there, by 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, the fighting had reached a significant enough scale to require Alexander's father and uncle to be brought back into the fore of the British Army to help fight off the American rebels. While Alexander would stay in America for a few years, by 1778, the War of Independence had not yet subsided, and it became dangerous for a young boy to remain. It's at this moment that he would make his way to Montreal, one of many loyalists who would flee the American colonies and later the Republic towards Canada in order to remain a part of the British Empire. These are what we call the United Empire Loyalists. Many of them would stay in the maritime provinces and help develop and populate them, but many also spread towards Upper and Lower Canada. Today, we find a great deal of descendants of the Loyalists spread out across Canada, including yours truly. Nowadays, it means sweet dick all for me to be a United Empire Loyalist. But at the time, it would have certainly aided immigrants from the States to show the appreciation they had for the British power. As the name indicates, it is a sign of loyalty. In times of war, that loyalty can help quite a bit. Digressions aside, young Alex Mackenzie arrives in Montreal in 1778. This is an extremely different Montreal from when we left off Champlain, and it's still quite different from the Montreal we know now. As explained last time, Montreal would have barely been a strategically placed checkpoint, where you could help establish soldiers or merchants. Now, while not being a diverse metropolis of a city, it was definitely getting more interesting. When the British took over the town in 1760, merchants were able to develop the fur trade exponentially from there. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. The Americans hadn't revolted yet. There was relative peace in the British colonies for a while, and this peace gave the economy time to develop, and Montreal was aided by this. Furthermore, the westward expansion of the fur trade and Montreal's central position along the St. Lawrence also helped it become a stopping point that needed to develop in order to satisfy the increasing number of traders and settlers who passed through. Among these passing people were a significant amount of Scots, which, if you'll recall 5 minutes ago, is what Alexander Mackenzie is. The contribution of the Scots to Montreal's development is still remembered to this day, actually. For example, the city's flag sports, among other things, a Scottish thistle. We even have a statue of Robert Burns near downtown Montreal. So there's still a significant remembrance of the Scottish community here in the city. It is here in Montreal that Alexander would join in 1779 the fur trading company Finlay and Gregory. One of the most important companies of the city, Finlay and Gregory would cease to exist less than 10 years later, in 1787, when it would be bought out by the Northwest Company. See, Even in the 18th century, larger companies kept swallowing up the little people. You'd think Disney could come up with a more original business model. I mean, it's getting to be old hat by now. Anyway, lame jokes about capitalism aside, it is during this time as part of the Northwest Company, later on, that Alexander Mackenzie would gain his notoriety as a pioneering explorer, and where he writes his journals explaining what happened during these explorations. Let's dive into that, shall we? Our story of Alexander Mackenzie's exploration begins in 1788 at Fort Chipewyan. This post was established that year by Mackenzie and others for the Northwest Company as a stopping point for traders. To give you a sense of where Fort Chipewyan is, it's about halfway across Canada. It is located on the northwest shore of Lake Athabasca, which itself is located on the border of modern Saskatchewan and Alberta. About 75% of it is in Saskatchewan, and the rest is in Alberta. We are just outside the edge of what at the time was Rupert's Land, the Hudson's Bay Company territory mentioned earlier. This should give you an idea of how expansive the Northwest Company was for a while, despite always playing second fiddle to the Hudson's Bay Company. It had territory all the way into Alberta while being based in Montreal. Obviously, it didn't control all that territory in between, but it definitely had posts that expanded quite far from its central hub, if you will. At this point in time, the fur trade did not go much further than this. Mackenzie and his compatriots within the company would travel around between Montreal and the outer limits established by forts like Chipewyan, using the many hundreds of waterways that Canada has as a way to get around. Once again, we haven't evolved that much from when Champlain was here in terms of transport. It wasn't the railway, obviously. It was boats and not steamboats for most of not steamboats, period. It was canoes and horses and walking. It was extremely difficult work to actually get around, obviously, but ultimately it was profitable as the fur trade showed little signs of stopping and there was a continual demand for the beaver pelts that were being brought out of Canada. After all, the winters in the Canadian landscape itself required these pelts, and people abroad wanted them, and they have winter elsewhere also, right? Alexander Mackenzie, though, thought in a fashion not too dissimilar to our old friend Champlain. He saw the potential for even more economic prosperity. Furthermore, being a very capable and intelligent explorer and trader, some historians believe that he wanted to leverage his upcoming exploits into a higher position within the Northwest Company, something that would never quite pan out for him as the head of the company, Simon McTavish, was grooming his nephew to take up the role instead. Blatant nepotism aside, the point is that Mackenzie was a very capable traveler, and he knew it. We'll get back to Lake Athabasca later, but for now, let's talk about Mackenzie's writing and how it fits into all of this. His journals, which would be published in book form in 1801, actually with a description of how the company operates and gets men to travel between Montreal and Fort Chipewyan. He is basing this off of his own experiences and observations, as well as what people from Montreal recount to him. So while he started writing his journal in 1789 from Fort Chipewyan, he can claim that his text describes a voyage from Montreal, as the title of his book implies, since he is simply backtracking the narrative to fill in the gaps as to how he got to the point he is at in Canada at the time he started writing. Once again, we will immediately notice that the type of writing is often less than literary, if you will. Like many explorers, Mackenzie, as he was traveling, would write short daily logs that would explain who and what he witnessed that day that was worthwhile. This origin as a chronicle of daily events makes the complete volume of his writing very straightforward. It is clearly written by a man who is constantly on the move, who finds it very difficult to turn observed facts into a solid explanatory account. As brave, outgoing, and forward-thinking as Alexander Mackenzie was, his journals indicate that he was a somewhat unreflective person. As an example, Here is an excerpt from Monday, June 8, 1789. The night was very boisterous, and the rain did not cease till 2 in the afternoon of this day. But as the wind did not abate in its violence, we were prevented from proceeding till the morrow. That's it for the whole day. Now, this is obviously an exaggerated situation. He does write more on other non-rainy days, but it nevertheless indicates just how little Mackenzie pushes his reflection about what he is doing. He explains what he sees and does, then ends the day. But as we saw on the last episode, such a trait does not mean that he is unimportant to the narrative of Canada. By 1789, Mackenzie would take this go-getting spirit and decide to set out from Fort Chipewyan in order to find a route through the rest of North America. His idea from this comes from another explorer called Peter Pond, who is a fascinating character in his own right, but for our purposes here, he is best known for his map of the Athabasca region that would help Mackenzie and many traders for generations. Pond also presented a theory that Cook's River provided a travel route from Great Slave Lake in the Northwestern Territories to the Pacific Ocean. Based off of Pond's maps and ideas, Mackenzie set out in July of 1789. Unfortunately, to his great disappointment, as indicated by his recounting of the events, Cook's River would not lead to the Pacific Ocean, instead leading Mackenzie and his men to the Arctic Ocean. If you're looking for such a river to follow along with on a map, you won't find it. In fact, following Alexander's use of the river, it would be renamed after him. So look for the Mackenzie River if you want to know where he entered the Arctic Ocean through. It would only take Mackenzie about 2 weeks to go down his namesake river, yet he describes a period of time that goes on for months before he returns to Fort Chipewyan. This is because Mackenzie spends a great deal of time in the northern part of the continent describing not only the environment and the animals he sees, but the life of the native peoples who live in the north. Today, we would refer to the populations there as the Inuit, but Mackenzie uses the archaic and now somewhat offensive term Eskimo. Once again, the detail is not excessive, but we are now privy to information that forms our mental image of what Canada looks like and how it is populated. It might not be as precise as we would like it to be, but these basic descriptions of the territory are essential to our perception of a nation and the formation of a later identity. If you want to delve into something a bit deeper, we can talk about the people who accompanied Mackenzie on his trek. In his own opening words, the crew consisted of 4 Canadians, 2 of whom were attended by their wives, and a German. We were accompanied also by an Indian who had acquired a title of English chief, and his 2 wives, in a small canoe with 2 young Indians, his followers in another small canoe. These men were engaged to serve us in the twofold capacity of interpreters and hunters. This chief has been a principal leader of his countrymen who were in the habit of carrying furs to Churchill Factory, Hudson's Bay, until of late very much attached to the interest of that company. These circumstances procured him with the appellation of English chief. There is very little that I can add concerning the Native Americans that accompany him, which he calls Indians, considering that they mostly accomplish the exact function that he describes of them in the passage I just read. What I do want to note here in relation to them is the continued reliance by the Europeans on the Native Americans. You might say, well, of course the British still need help. This is unknown territory. True, but I must mention, albeit beyond the purview of this episode, that the natives are still important in more densely settled areas of the colony as well. Native Americans do trade with Europeans and are very much enlisted during wars that the British might face on the North American continent against, for example, the Americans. After all, they are very aware of the ins and outs of the landscape and are a valuable help as soon as you go outside the cities and towns. The other thing I want to mention is the use of the term Canadians. This can lead to an interesting observation on identity. These Canadians, who are French speakers from Montreal, do not identify as French, but as a group of voyageurs canadiens, which translates in English to Canadian travelers. The people of Lower Canada would, from before the British conquest, have started to identify as being Canadiens, and the British in the US would have recognized them as such. Already they were forming a group that was culturally separate from the French, even though they spoke the same language. The term Canadian would stick with specifically French speakers for quite some time, but progressively the mostly English-speaking population of Upper Canada and the population that would grow in Lower Canada would also use the term for themselves, rather than simply British, Irish, Scottish, and so on. Now, I obviously want to touch upon the second, and arguably more important, voyage that Mackenzie embarks upon in 1793, so a few years after the Arctic expedition, which also begins from Fort Chipewyan all the way to Bella Coola on the Pacific coast. There is, of course, going to be some overlap in themes and information, so I'll concentrate on what we can gather specifically from this second voyage, even if it is the one that Mackenzie is most known for. For a trip that literally takes him through the Rocky Mountains, we will see that Mackenzie is surprisingly fast in going and coming back. There is a very similar style of description in this voyage as there was in the 1789 Arctic expedition. Obviously, his writing style is not going to change that much between the few years between both voyages, but it's worth mentioning. The major differences between the two volumes are in the landscapes that are described, namely the Rocky Mountains, and the peoples that are encountered. Now, despite the lack of detailed analysis, I do like the implication and image given to us of a kind of natural barrier being formed by the Rockies. Neither Mackenzie nor the natives who accompany him know exactly what lies beyond, or at least the latter plead ignorance. I guess this is me inserting my own tension into the narrative, but I can't help but imagining myself in Alexander Mackenzie's place and having to cross a massive mountain range and having to come to terms with what may lie ahead. And despite some communication abilities between him and the natives that are traveling with him, he can't really explain these sentiments to them. The danger that is faced by Mackenzie does seem to be a bit more present in this second voyage. He does recount what he thinks he might encounter that could be deadly, but when he does run into such events, you can definitely get the sense that there is a life or death situation going on at that moment. The trekking through the mountains are perilous. The canoe he and his men are riding in breaks more than once, and there is a village of Pacific Native Americans who attack the travelers. Here's a quote from that entry. I was surprised to see two men running down towards me from one of the houses, with daggers in their hands and fury in their aspect. From their hostile appearance, I could not doubt of their purpose. I therefore stopped short, threw down my cloak, and put myself in a posture of defense, with my gun presented towards them. Fortunately for me, they knew the effect of firearms and instantly dropped their daggers, which was fastened by a string to their wrists and had before been held in a menacing attitude. Now, we have to put ourselves in his place, right? If he has to put every chances he has on his side. If Mackenzie gets injured, or if his canoe, as I mentioned before, breaks permanently and he doesn't have the available material to fix it or to build a new one, he's screwed, right? He's in the middle of nowhere. It's not like there are hospitals that he can just simply go to very easily. And as you can see, not everybody is friendly to him. So he really has to be careful about what he does. And this last event is actually what convinces Alexander Mackenzie to turn around and return to Fort Chipewyan, because mostly he feels satisfied at that point, as he has found a passage to the Pacific Ocean. And now that he knows how to get through, he can let other people deal with the perils that he was not necessarily always equipped to handle himself. Something that occurs in both voyages that is very interesting and contrasts nicely with Champlain's writing is the increased detail he puts about the various native populations. Where Champlain described the ways of living mostly, Mackenzie does this, but adds the extra step throughout his travels of compiling a type of vocabulary of various native peoples' words, much like the missionaries would have done in the past and continue to do after Mackenzie. Our explorer writes down many utilitarian words in his journal so as to better communicate and interact with the natives as he goes along, thereby not having to rely solely on the faith he would have in the translators he would have with him, and to try and avoid certain conflicts with the natives that I just mentioned that are on the Pacific coast. Considering that these are sometimes the first we hear of certain tribes and nations, this type of vocabulary is really quite interesting when we are creating a multifaceted image of the Canadian landscape. I think I can actually end the description of the second voyage pretty much here. And I know what you might be thinking, oh my God, you're hardly touching upon the fact that he discovered a route to the Pacific, or a more direct route rather. We knew of the Pacific beforehand. But Mackenzie himself doesn't say much to that effect. He's very happy that he discovered a passage from Chipewyan to the Pacific, and that he managed to establish a clear route from Montreal to the Pacific, but he doesn't, again, develop much in it. I'd much rather focus on the novel side of it, on what he actually provides in terms of description of his environment and his contact with other populations, which I feel are much more important in the long run. As always, as a conclusion, let's observe how exactly this all comes together into an important piece of Canadian literature and history. Once Alexander's trips are complete, he concludes the voyages from Montreal with a short geographical view, as he calls it, in which Mackenzie attempts an organized account of the whole of British North America, essentially Eastern Canada. This really highlights the perception that he had of his own travels as having a geographic and economic importance for the British Empire and the Northwest Company. He, consequently, is integral to providing the empirical basis of the first cohesive image of Canada as we know it today. The sheer magnitude of this vision contrasts sharply with Mackenzie's restrained and very factual writing style. While he is very observant, painstakingly so, both of real dramatic events and the world around him, his trader's eye always measured and counted everything. But beyond the purely mercantile, there is an aspect to Mackenzie's journals that I think can be developed further. It puts on clear display the relative slowness in which Canada would develop. With what Alexander Mackenzie reported, there came an understanding of the unfathomable size of the Canadian landscape. This fact, compared with a relative lack of people, still to this day, there's about 35 million people in the entire territory of Canada, and 90% of that is on the border. So there's really not that many people in Canada, even less back then, obviously. This minimal size of a population compared to the size of the country clashes with, for example, something like the United States, who by this point were on their way to becoming quite the industrialized nation with much more people in it. This distinction between Canada and the US would continue for many generations, with the former being better known for its natural resources and relation to nature, and the latter being more of a mechanized powerhouse. I can't say that it is that much of a stretch to say that Canada's special brand of conservatism, which was traditionally present in many of our major political parties, stems from this association with being a less modernized and technological nation. Mackenzie does not speak to this, of course, but I think it's an interesting thought exercise regardless, and one that stems from the writings that he provided. What does develop, not always as smoothly as we will see in later episodes, is the multicultural society that Canada would expound early in its history, and still to this day. Again, Mackenzie does not refer to this directly, but reading between the lines is what we need to do when approaching literary history. The French Canadians, Scots, British, Native Americans, and even the Germans are all people that are mentioned as being present on the territory by Mackenzie, where in Champlain's New France, the presence of something other than French or native populations would have been relatively uncommon in Canadian territory. We see a shift in demographics by the late 18th century, one that would continue to shift over time and continue to evolve based on who comes and goes on the territory and how these people identify based on their culture. The importance of Alexander Mackenzie's contribution to the British Empire and its trading capabilities was actually immediately recognized. And when he would return to Great Britain in 1799 to present his findings and retire from fur trading, his notes and their scope would justify his receiving of a knighthood, officially making him Sir Alexander Mackenzie. While there would be later falsifications of his text, which added flourishes and a much more literary feeling to the writings, much like Champlain had been a victim of, by the way, this knighthood was given in honor of the visionary insight provided by the original manuscript, which portrayed a single vision for Canada and its ability to be something so much greater in size and in economic structure than what it had been up until that point. And I think that's really one of the major aspects that we can take away from this text. That being said, I think I'll end it right there. This was a bit of a shorter episode compared to last week, but I think this should just about do it. Thank you everyone for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at draftsgalore if you want to reach out through there. I don't post a lot, it's just a way of communicating if you want. You can also suggest topics and themes that you would like to hear me explore in the future. And finally, if you would consider leaving a review, even if there are no comments, it would be very appreciated. It really does help. All right, the shameless plugs are out of the way. I can now say that I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.